Welcome everyone for the second week of this Land-Terms seminar. We are extremely honored to have Vida Maralani from Cornell University to give the seminar tonight, this evening. Well, for Vida, it's the noon over there in the US. Vida is a sociologist at Cornell Department of Sociology, and she's a quite prolific sociologist, and she has published in the areas of like demography and sociology in all of the top journals, American Journal of Sociology, American Sociology Review, Demography, as well as in education. Like she has published a number of papers in the field of education, in American Journal of Educational Research, as well as Sociology of Education. And her research is really about how families consolidate resources and then come up and produce and contribute to inequality, or deprive of household resources and then contribute to inequality in general. Like her research is in the in the nexus of like race, education, and inequality and demography altogether. I have witnessed Vida giving multiple talks over the years, and I'm impressed in each one of those talks. So I'm really excited to hear this paper, which I haven't heard before. And I want to give the floor to Vida, and we are very lucky to have her. Thank you so much, Vida, for joining us tonight, and we're looking forward to hear it. So there's just the rules of the game for anyone who have joined for the first time our seminar series. I'll be like keeping an eye on the chat function. If you have any clarification questions, please do feel comfortable to ask them, post them on the chat. And Vida is happy to get interrupted, and I'm going to read out your questions to Vida for any clarification questions. If you have substantive questions and comments, we will have 20 minutes at the end to raise those questions, substantive comments and questions. And the seminar slot is booked for 90 minutes. Around 60 to 65 minutes, I will be stopping recording for anyone who wants to hang out and ask for follow-up questions. The remaining 25 minutes, Vida will be with us and answering those follow-up questions, which are not going to be recorded. And we're going to be happy to talk about it. And at the 19th minute, we're going to say goodbye to Vida. So that's the like engagement plan. So I'll just then leave the floor to Vida and we start. Thank you, Vida.
Thank you, Berkay. Thank you for that extremely warm welcome and that gracious introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm actually perfectly happy to have you ask substantive questions that are fairly brief as well. I kind of think sometimes the conversation goes better when you're able to ask what you're thinking in the moment, and I'm able to answer if I can or if that's appropriate. So if you'll allow me to just put it off if it's too tangential, then I would welcome any kind of questions you have. I've been trained and work with economists. I'm pretty robust to being interrupted. I'm married to an economist, so don't feel shy. I'm pretty good at holding my own in terms of getting a word in when I need to. Let me start by saying that this project actually has benefited enormously from the work of an undergraduate, a former undergraduate at Yale named Isadora Milanez. She has moved on to greener pastures and isn't really active on the project anymore, but I just want to acknowledge the tremendous amount of effort that she's put into the project. And so that's why she's listed here. It's also a project that's actually pretty different from my general portfolio, which, as Berkay said, centers on the intersection of stratification and demography, entirely quantitative, but also really contemporary, or at least focused predominantly over the last 50 years. And so this is a divergence from that, but really it comes from just trying to understand where inequality begins and how it changes over time. That's probably the core thing that defines my research portfolio, is the dynamics of inequality, allow me to understand both the mechanisms, but also seeing it in motion seems like it really helps me explain it, or at least model it in a more effective way. So you'll see that this historical view, I'm not a historical sociologist, but this historical view allows me to capture that motion in a way that I think is really productive intellectually. It's a project that's very much in the works, so you would be making it better by asking both easy and hard questions, and I'm super glad to incorporate that. Okay, so breastfeeding is both a biological, now let me shrink you a tiny bit so that I can actually see what I'm doing. So breastfeeding is both a biological and a cultural process, and so let me give you a little bit of background. For those of you who have breastfed, you have your own ideas of what it is, but for the rest of us, let me just contextualize it for you because it's not a common topic. at least in sociology. So it's biological in the sense that it's initiated by labor and birth, and so it happens, but it doesn't have to be done. And then it's an embodied practice in the sense that only women can do it, and it requires their physical bodies to be done. Now, it's a feeding practice, so infant feeding practices have changed a lot over time. They differ by country, but also within countries over time, and even within countries by social group. So, as soon as you have feeding and food, you have the cultural and social connections that go with that. In the lower and middle income countries, women breastfeed for longer durations on average, and it's usually the lower SES women who breastfeed for longer. Now, in contrast, in higher income nations, women in higher income nations breastfeed for less time on average than women in lower income nations, but the gradient is reversed. Higher SES women in these richer nations breastfeed for longer durations than women in the lower and middle income countries. In the big picture, among the wealthy nations, the US has lower rates of breastfeeding initiation and lower durations on average, but I learned today that actually the UK has even lower average rates than the US. And so maybe some of what I'm saying to you will potentially be culturally similar to what the UK parts are. I'm only going to speak about the US today. Since the 1970s, there's been a very strong policy focus in the US, but really internationally, I feel comfortable kind of saying this, a very strong public health and public policy focus on the health benefits of breastfeeding, both for infants, and initially the literature was quite large for infants, and now I would say equally large for mothers. So a very strong priority because of the health benefits that are perceived. Currently, the American Association of Pediatricians, the Surgeon General, which is our main health post, and the WHO say that women should breastfeed infants exclusively for the first 6 months of life, and then combined with other foods, though I would say preferably not formula by these organizations' standards, until at least 12 months. And the WHO's most current standards actually recommend up to 2 years. So that's nursing well into toddlerhood. Now, I don't actually want to spend any time defending whether or not breastfeeding causally produces better infant health or better maternal health, because that's not what I do. And although I can tell you what experimental research is out there, and it's pretty limited because this is not an easy, human subjects experiment to run, there is actually a little bit of experimental data. I guess I think it doesn't matter if it's causal or not for the project I'm doing today. What I want to instead maybe convince you of is that the information is ubiquitously disseminated and heard, such that we take it for truth. And I think this is what really matters in terms of thinking about where the feeding practice fits into women's lives. So here's an example of the WHO's key infant and young child feeding. And so I'll just highlight for you, kind of what they link it to. They link it to avoiding stunting, avoiding overweight and obesity, to good nutrition, to improving IQ, to improving school attendance, higher income in adult life, economic gain. So this is from the child's perspective. Who wouldn't want this for their child? And then from the NIH, here are some examples on the maternal side of things that are associated with, at least, and certainly communicated to women as the benefits. And so reducing diabetes risk, cardiovascular risk, breast cancer risk, ovarian cancer risk, facilitating weight loss, reducing post-maternal bleeding, which can actually be quite dangerous, and reducing stress. Overall, all of us would want that. But the health and the policy parts of breastfeeding are really just one part. And because it is a feeding practice, because it really is one of several choices of how to feed an infant, and because it's embodied for the women who do it, you should also see it as a cultural thing. And so women, their partners, their social groups play an important role in kind of the choices that are made and how the choices are prioritized and understood. different social groups have different norms and values about both mothering, but also the body, because it's an embodied practice. So on a kind of cultural part, there's a lot to understand. Then just on a kind of a policy welfare part, you should know that the US offers very little formal leave support. And so there's very little in terms of protections for women in dedicating a lot of time to this kind of child investment in the first year of life. And it's unambiguous that American women find these guidelines hard to follow. So it's unambiguous that women don't meet these guidelines. Now, since the 1980s, breastfeeding has also taken what I would describe, I'm going to call it a symbolic value. And it's a symbolic part of a broader movement in parenting and mothering practices. And I really think of those as different things, right? So I think of parenting practices as investments in children that either parent can make, and maybe think of reading every day to your child as another symbolic kind of activity that's now all over the guidelines for what we should do, but either parent can do that. But I would say breastfeeding is the other symbolic practice that we hear a lot about as part of good parenting. And it's become very centrally tied since the 1980s to this narrative of child investment, good mothering, concerted cultivation, which intersects with SES such that higher SES women are able to enact these things more effectively because of their socioeconomic position. And so, breastfeeding is tied into this idea of expensive children, but in this case, it's a time budget constraint. It's expensive in terms of a woman's time. And so kind of being able to find that time to produce it. And so there's also this kind of central and symbolic role that breastfeeding, or on the other hand, not breastfeeding, can play in kind of the narrative of mothering and mothering norms, which I'll come back to. Okay, so let me just give you the overview. Here are the indicators in the most recent period that I could find them in the US. So about fewer than half, but about 47% of infants born in 2017 were breastfed exclusively for 3 months, and about a quarter exclusively at 6 months. So, we're pretty far from the guidelines, as you can see. A pretty large share of women in the US initiate breastfeeding. So 84% of births in 2017 were breastfed at all. And if we think about any breastfeeding, which means in combination with formula or other kinds of foods, you see that the numbers look slightly better. And so 58% of babies were breastfed at all at 6 months. But again, a pretty low share, only about a third were breastfed at all up to the full first year. And so, we won't even approach the second year because we can barely hit the guidelines for the first year. Now, since you are in England and I am in England in spirit with you today, here are the numbers for England, which you'll see is actually even worse than the US. So according to these data, 74% of mothers actually initiate breastfeeding. So that's lower than the 80s. 44% are breastfeeding at 6 weeks, and about a third are breastfeeding at 6 months. So just to put it into context for you, and then about only 1% of babies are exclusively breastfed until they're 6 months old, which is a lower number. So that English number is a lower number than the US number. So I'm happy to talk to you about the UK at the end, though you'll be teaching me about it, but just to give you some context for it. Okay, so before I launch into the kind of the paper itself, one of the things I want to convince you of is that we see a lot of information and images about breastfeeding, and they work on different levels. So here is an example of the public health messaging that women see. It describes breastfeeding as natural, healthy, saving money, and what your baby deserves, right? So this kind of idea of the moral imperative. And then some messaging about why breastfeed a toddler, something that very few women can actually do. And so here are some additional kind of science-based I'll put science in quotes because I can't tell you it comes from actual scientific experiments, but science-based notions for why women should breastfeed into the second year of life. So that's the public health messaging. But there's also cultural messaging. So here's Giselle, breastfeeding at work. Here's Angela Lindvall, breastfeeding at work. Here's Olivia Wilde, breastfeeding at work. Here's someone who got an enormous amount of attention, Jamie Lynn Grummett, for breastfeeding. Now this little guy, he's made to be bigger than he actually is. He's only 3 years old, but he sure looks big right there standing on his chair. But a lot of attention for breastfeeding the older child and this engagement with whether or not this kind of long-term investment and the related cultural ideas of attachment parenting are to be adopted or thrust upon women in the US or not. This cover sold a lot of magazines. So Time is also using images like this to sell a lot of magazines. And then it's pretty easy for me to find you an op-ed every month in the New York Times or the Washington Post that has a woman arguing against the overselling of breastfeeding such that women feel shame for not doing it, and they're told that this is the most important thing that's to be done for the babies. And so, stepping back, I'm trying to convince you that although you might be used to thinking about breastfeeding along only one dimension, say the public health or the public policy dimension or the cultural dimension, it actually, it encompasses a lot of these things. And women are making these choices by kind of thinking about the portfolio of things that they hear, and that it really touches on a lot of different parts of parenting. I haven't addressed this, but my husband can't help but mention to me that it also has the word breast in it, which is salacious enough. And so I could also, he says, you always focus on the food, but there's this breast part. And so we could also talk about breastfeeding in public and all the things that are then contested about the display of the breast in the public sphere. But that's for a different talk altogether. Okay, so let me come back to my stratification self and tell you that I see breastfeeding as a lens on inequality. I do a lot of work on child investment, and I use breastfeeding as a kind of child investment that women do that's very time intensive. But today I really want to kind of talk to you about breastfeeding in a broader way. So on the one hand, breastfeeding has been described as a moral project, a kind of health investment where you start your children off with the best possible investments as you can. And Faircloth has argued that if you don't do that, women who choose not to do that are foregoing a potential investment that they could have made in their children. So they're withholding a potential investment. And so that's kind of the judgy health investment part of it. Other scholars have described it both as a social class project where we demonstrate the SES differences between us by doing these different embodied practices. Similarly, relatedly, a project of whiteness where we do race. By breastfeeding then is a way of doing race because there are these large disparities in breastfeeding by race in the US. A symbolic part of intensive mothering, which I've kind of talked to you already about. And then on the psychology, social psychology, kind of cultural feminist part, this idea of mother-centered attachment parenting. I can tell you more about cultural feminism at the end if you're interested in that, this idea that women can choose child investment as an empowering thing, but it's also kind of tangential to today. Okay, let me show you some of these inequalities and kind of quantify them for you a tiny bit. Here are, in the US, breastfeeding differences by, it says, let's see, yeah, by education. And so I show you 3 measures, breastfeeding at all, initiating breastfeeding, breastfeeding at 6 months, and breastfeeding at 12 months. And you can see that the educational gradient in breastfeeding is pretty dramatic. So it's unambiguously the case that highly educated women breastfeed longer and more intensively. So I haven't shown you the exclusivity numbers, but they are far more likely to breastfeed exclusively, and they're far more likely to breastfeed for longer. Let me just pause, just so that Berkay and I, for many years, worked at Yale, where we heard about the German educational system, and we were always confused about what the levels were. So let me pause for a moment and say the major educational categories in the US are not completing a secondary degree, so that's 12 years of schooling in the US. Completing this secondary degree, that's the second bar here. So that's what I'll, if I'm not paying attention, call high school. Then there's some university, kind of attending some university, can be a 2-year university or a 4-year university, and then getting at least a 4-year degree, a bachelor's degree, here is in the college completed category. So those are the categories of education that I'm going to use and that I will present to you as the major groups to kind of think about in the US. Okay, so the educational gradient is large, and it is both explained, people have both explained it using resource arguments, who is able to afford this behavior, but also explained by actual cultural beliefs in differences in what people believe is needed for investing as best as you can in your child. And then I would say actually in some critical circles also described negatively, in the sense that some scholars have argued that this kind of health, this non-causal health argument preys on the highly educated by just kind of getting them to engage in thinking that they can do this thing that's science-based when it's in fact not science-based. So some of that has also been viewed negatively by some critical gender scholars. But kind of on the face of it, the gradient is large. Let me show you the race gradient, which is the other major dimension of inequality here in breastfeeding in the US. So it might not be as you expect, actually, because although it's true that Black Americans breastfeed at the lowest rates in the US and white Americans breastfeed at higher rates, Hispanic women and Asian Americans breastfeed at higher rates than even white Americans. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a tremendous amount of data on these groups, so I can't do very much with that today. But it is an interesting, an interesting reverse gradient in the sense that Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans initiate breastfeeding at higher rates than white Americans. On average, white Americans and Hispanic Americans actually breastfeed for about the same amount of time, but that's conditioning on initiation. And then Black Americans breastfeed for significantly less time. They both are far less likely to initiate, and even if they do initiate, they breastfeed for lower duration. So this is a major cleavage, and the educational differences between the groups, the compositional differences, don't explain away this educational gradient, this racial ethnic ingredient and gradient. So it's not the fact that this is just entirely compositional. There seems to be some other explanations that go along with it. So with that as a backdrop, let me tell you what the goal is here. So we're going to try to ask, when did these disparities emerge? How have they changed over time, focusing really narrowly on education and race? Are education and race relatively independent dimensions, or are they intersectional? Does the educational gradient work the same within race, or is it different by race, is how I think about that. Then looking in more recent decades, does the dramatic rise in non-marital fertility and differences in age at first birth by race explain these massive gaps by race ethnicity that we see? And then I'm going to come back at the end and ask, are these patterns consistent with these cultural explanations that we have in the literature that suggest that it's really the rise of intensive parenting among the high SES women that's kind of producing these dramatic increases in breastfeeding among the highly educated? That's something I just find interesting in understanding inequality in the US. So there's a lot of data behind what I'm going to show you. It's actually, I combine all the waves of the National Survey of Family Growth from 1973 to 2011 with the 1965 National Fertility Survey in order to be able to combine comparable trend data by both the mother's birth cohort and the year of the child's birth. So I'm basically going to try to piece together whatever variables that I feel confident that I can harmonize and try to piece together historical data going pretty far back with some limits, because ultimately I'm a pretty neurotic quantitative analyst. And so I only use years when I can find data on at least 50 mothers, or if we're doing children, 50 children for the particular category I'm interested in. And so if we're thinking about Black children born to women with less education, I'm only going to grab up that number in a year of the data if I have at least a sample size of 50 to get that mean out of the data. I'm going to show you results for all births, but it actually all holds if you consider only first births. I do a lot of breastfeeding research, and I would be the first one to tell you that the cleanest way to study breastfeeding is to study the first birth's breastfeeding status, because subsequent births are really informed by whether the mother breastfed the first one or not. But for historical data, I actually think it's better to use all the births. So I'm going to use some non-parametric smoothing methods to describe for you what's going on, and then I'm going to parameterize the data very, very gently using piecewise splines so that I can do basic testing between groups across periods. You'll see what I mean in a minute. It's pretty descriptive. And then I'm going to estimate basic regressions that I can then try to linearly decompose to answer this question about how much of it is due to the timing of birth and the rise of single motherhood among these different groups. Okay, I'm going to pause and say, are we good, or?
We are good, yeah, so no questions.
Okay. So here is the simplest view of the data, 100 years worth of data on the proportion breastfeeding. Now the orange line shows you the trends by the mother's year of birth, and the dashed, I don't know, cayenne line shows you the data by the child's year of birth. I'm a demographer by training, and so I just don't know how to show you anything that doesn't tell you that the cohort and period data are not exactly the same. So I enact my demographer status by showing you both, and then I tell you that I'm going to just show you the yearly data going forward. And so what you see is from the start of the 1900s down to the 1950s in the mother's birth years, or from the 1920s to the 1970s in the child's birth years, there was this dramatic decline in breastfeeding in the United States, such that it just kind of bottomed out in the 1970s. Now that comes from two places. One is the availability, the rise, and the marketing of formula milk as an alternative. And the other is a transformation of medical practice such that information and authority about best practices are transferred from a mother-centric or a community-centric view to a hierarchical medical model where a professional tells you what is the best practice to do. And as the medical profession organized and then decided that formula was best for children, then that information is provided to women as well. I won't tell you about this, but I guess I feel like you should also know that there was this massive marketing campaign by Nestle, both domestically and internationally, to say that formula was actually better for your children. And it was hard not to be persuaded by that. But so that's also, market forces are also at play, but that's for a different day. Then a big turn in the 1970s, following about 10 years in the, between 1955 and 1965, first with the rise of actually Dr. Spock and his mother-centric focus on parenting and his child-rearing manuals were really effective. Some early emerging research about the benefits of breast milk and a rise of kind of a more mother-centric model of parenting that explains the U-turn. As the research comes out, the policies kick in, and then a dramatic increase in policies supporting breastfeeding practices among the population, and then a continued rise. So let me show you some of the major policies. The Child Nutrition Act actually enacted a program called WIC, Women, Infants, and Children, which is a income and nutritional supplement for women in poverty, and that program has breastfeeding as its cornerstone, as kind of supporting breastfeeding as a cornerstone. So that's enacted here. In 1978, the pediatricians formally changed their position to human milk being best for babies. In 1989, Congress actually earmarked a portion of this WIC program specifically for breastfeeding support. So more money went pouring into those programs. Maybe I should be explicit, obviously the composition of the women who use WIC is different from the composition of the general US population. So these policies disproportionately affect poor women and therefore disproportionately affect women of different race ethnicities. But I'll come back to that in a minute. It's happening, the big picture point is it's happening in the 80s. Then in 1990, the Department of Health and Human Services in the US also decided to initiate its own non-poverty-based support of breastfeeding programs. And so that's then another kind of broad-based. So what I'm hoping to convince you of is that this stuff isn't happening in a vacuum, but there's this pretty strong policy support that's going on. At the same time, in the 1980s, that this rise of this culture of intensive parenting, where you're supposed to build the uber child by your, reading to the child and playing on the floor with them and getting them music early and getting them language exposure. This is also beginning in the cultural sphere as well. Pretty big change in the US in 1993, the Family Medical Leave Act allows women to take unpaid time off for 6 weeks if they'd like to. Oh, okay, so those are the overall trends. And now let me show you the differences by race over the same period. I'm switching over to the child year perspective. So now we're just going to think about the year the children are born. So the blue line shows Black Americans, the red line shows white Americans. And what you can see is, in fact, Black Americans used to breastfeed at higher rates before 1955. So the data series begins with Black Americans breastfeeding at higher rates than white Americans, a crossover in the 50s, and then a reversal and a widening of the gap such that white Americans breastfeed at higher rates than Black Americans. First this ballooning and then this narrowing. And so one of the things that I think is really important to take away is that this racial gap that exists today didn't used to be the case. And so the process has really transformed. And when I say breastfeeding changes a lot over time, here's a pretty good example of that, right? It's not just happening uniformly across the population. So those are the racial gaps. I'm talking to you about education as well. So let me show you the education gaps. And so remember those categories. Orange is not completing the secondary degree. Green is completing that secondary degree, but nothing more. Blue is some university training, but not a degree. And red is completing the university degree. Now, the data are particularly sparse before the 1960s on this category of having a college degree because a smaller share of the population actually completed this transition. And so I would argue that a careful way to present you these trends is to parameterize the early data into only 3 categories, where I combine any university training into one category, up until the point where there's actually enough data for me to separate them for you. And so then starting in the 1960s, there's basically enough data support to show you the full distribution. This is a non-parametric kernel smoother. There's not very much going on other than my trying not to parameterize it for you in any kind of heavy-handed way. So what you see is in the early period, the women at the lowest and the highest education categories actually had more similar breastfeeding rates. And the women in this intermediate high school only category had lower breastfeeding rates. It all starts to decline, but I want you to kind of look at the trend for the dashed black line and the red line and see that in fact it declines the absolute least for these highly educated women. And it's actually pretty hard to fit a slope that's significantly different from zero for these college educated women across these 10-year periods between 1940 and 1970. Now, there's a lot of noise, so I don't know for sure that this decline here in the black lines is actually not significant. I think at the end of the day, when we fit it, we decided it was actually significantly different from zero. It's going down, but that's parameterized. But what you see is that for sure the college educated women from very early on and well before the 1980s were breastfeeding at higher rates long before the rhetoric of intensive parenting was in the air. So the highly educated women for a long time in the US have seen this practice as something that they want to pursue. And that the gap between the college educated women and the some college women is actually pretty large. And so it's not just about some exposure to higher education, but there's something that's either selective or transformative about that college schooling. And that the lines for the lower educated women alternate back and forth and cross over in ways that would be productive to think about the policy and the information that comes out with regards to the benefits of breastfeeding. I'm not going to do that today, but just to say that starting in 1970, the lines for the lower educated women actually cross and create this gradient that's in the reverse for the lower educated women. And so that's kind of the educational pattern that exists across the 70 years for which we can have pretty good data on that. Now, I told you that it was about the intersection. So let me show you the intersection of the two. The panel above has Black Americans. The panel below has white Americans. These are the same education gradients now shown to you for each of the individual groups. The noise grows because the groups are now smaller than the whole, but you can see that the pattern is actually pretty similar, which is there's very little differentiated educational gradient in breastfeeding early on in the time series. There's a crossover period where the lines start to diverge, and then a pretty consistent gradient that emerges. But what's interesting here is that the gradient emerges at different time periods for the two groups. And so, with your statistical eye, as opposed to a statistical test, you could say, well, it's for whites, it's really just starting to emerge in the 1950s, and it's actually there by 1955. And by 1960, I can actually really differentiate the red line from the blue line as well. But for Black Americans, that's happening 15 years later. For Black Americans, the educational gradient is emerging not until the 1970s. And so one of the interesting puzzles from my perspective in thinking about why it is that this educational gradient exists is to ask, well, if it's really about education, why does it emerge at different times for two different social groups? And if anything, the Black college-educated women are more highly selective than the white ones, right? So if you're kind of thinking about the selectivity, it's the Black women who are more selected, unless we want to take this other view and say, perhaps the quality is really different between the two groups. I don't know which one prevails. But so that's something overall. Now, what really matters, though, is to compare levels across the groups. So let me do that for you as humanely as I know how. And so here are the trends for Black and white women with less than high school schooling or only high school schooling. And so what you see is kind of small gaps, small differences between before 1970, a large difference emerging after 1970, no educational differentiation between these two pretty different school categories, actually, in the US educational system for Blacks. And an initial difference for the whites between 1970 and 1985, where the high school women get breastfeed a little bit more than the not high school women, but then it disappears. And this kind of consistent racial pattern emerges. And so one of the things that's surprising about this part of the race education intersection, I'm going to argue, and I welcome your feedback on this, is that it doesn't actually exist very strongly at the bottom of the education distribution. So it's a racial gap at the bottom of the educational distribution, much more than it is a race by education gap at the bottom of the educational distribution, except for the fact that this solid green line is a lot higher than the dashed green line, right? So it's, except for the fact that at every level of schooling, the whites are higher than the Blacks. So that's unambiguous, right? But the orange and green lines aren't separated from each other in the way that you would expect an educational gradient to potentially work. Okay, let's go to the top of the education distribution. At the top of the educational distribution, dashed lines are Black Americans, solid lines are white Americans. Okay, so dashed line is Black, solid is white, red line is college completed, and blue line is some college. And so there's basically no difference between 1955, and then this divergence occurs. For whites, the two educational groups are separated from each other in levels, and they continue to kind of stay differentiated such that college-educated white women breastfeed more than some college-educated white women. And that gradient exists for Black women as well, though it's smaller. And potentially that's because there's more noise in the data because there's not as big of a group. But it's there as well. But what's really interesting is this lagged, well, at least to me, what's really interesting is this lagged rise of breastfeeding rates for the college-educated Black women. It takes them the better part of the 100 years to catch up to the white college-educated women, such that you can't actually reject that they're lower for the entire trend relative to the white college-educated women. So here I would argue there's some evidence actually that the intersection is important. So it's not just that college-educated women have internalized this kind of intensive rhetoric, but that there's a real difference between the way that Black and white mothers have either internalized the rhetoric or are able to enact the behavior, such that the college-educated Black women have rates that are similar to the some college-educated whites. And both those groups breastfeed at significantly higher proportions than the some college-educated Black women. So I think another interesting question is, why are these some college-educated Black women not breastfeeding as highly as their white counterparts? What's going on there? Okay, I'm going to skip. We call this the fifth. Okay.
So I think if you can wrap up in 5 minutes, that will leave us.
Yeah, sure. Yep. Okay, so I said to Berkai, I brought a lot of slides and then I would skip whenever he told me to skip. So the last piece I guess I want to answer for you is how much of this gap is explained by differences in age at first birth or single motherhood, and the differences in race and education with that. So we take the total gap. I'm going to skip a picture for you. Okay, so we take the total gap between Blacks and whites only. We've omitted women of other race. Between 1980 and 2005, this is the part of the data that we can reliably analyze. That gap is about 0.27. And we use Blinder Oaxaca with a variant to try to deal with the fact that many of our categories are binary as opposed to continuous. So that's just this, I can tell you more about that. And we ask how much do compositional differences versus effect differences explain this gap that we see? And what we find is pretty interesting actually, which is the compositional differences for sure explain a big chunk. So when we use Blacks as the reference group, the compositional parts explain about 40% of the gap we observe. The effects only explain about 11%, but there's a pretty large share unexplained at 56%. And then if we use whites as the reference, there's nothing to guarantee that the results will be the same depending on how you decompose. So there's really nothing wrong here. This is just kind of the algebra of how it works. When we use whites as the reference, we explain a little bit, composition explains a little bit less. The share unexplained is still pretty large. So compositional differences in these demographic behaviors explain some, but not the lion's share of the differences between the groups, which I think would take me back to asking then what is the cultural intersections with these socioeconomic characteristics that might be at play in trying to explain that. Okay, so where does this bring us? I hope that I've shown you evidence that gets you thinking about how education and race are systematically linked kind of across the 20th century with breastfeeding practice. But I hope I've also put a shadow of doubt in your mind's eye that it rises from this rhetoric of intensive parenting, which really emerges in the late 1980s, that it has historically a much earlier rise that's much harder to explain using our current arsenal of explanations. It's an embodied practice that we in the quantitative area almost never are willing to analyze with respect to markets and culture because we don't know how to model that in a regression, but it's just unambiguously the case that this is how it works. And so that's an interesting and problematic part of studying this outcome. I think the intersection of education and race is particularly interesting to actually help us untangle what is driving these patterns. And we could talk more about that in the Q&A. I guess I want to argue, and I'd be curious what you think, that the major increase in breastfeeding rates is a lot more consistent with this rising health narrative. Cochran kind of talks about the rise of health investment as a status to be achieved in the modern era, similar to obtaining education and wealth. You know, health status and healthy lifestyles has become a status that then itself is to be achieved. I think symbolically you can think of smoking that way, in the ways that you kind of think of them as tied. I'm beginning to think that breastfeeding status has that kind of health moral imperative to it as well. And so I think that we have to look at other explanations for the rise of these inequalities, even if now in the current period, it is very consistent with this intensive mothering rhetoric. I don't mean to say it's not true that it's part of intensive mothering. I just mean to say it probably didn't come from that. And I didn't talk about the kind of the gender and the body part of it, but I leave you with this cartoon as a way of thinking about that part as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vida, for
sure.
Yeah, that's a great picture.
Shall I stop this? Shall I stop the share, Berkay? Or
as you wish.
Well, I'll leave it in case people have specific questions about the slides.
Good. We do have one question already in the chat. Valentina asked the question, whether the higher rates of college-educated women breastfeeding in the 70s be related to cultural feminism itself? I think that's Valentina's question. From this question, people can unmute themselves and raise their hands. I'll just give them mic to them. Yeah.
I think of cultural feminism as a phenomenon of the modern era, actually, rather than a phenomenon of the 1970s. I think of second wave feminism as the main feminist phenomenon, that was really about trying to think of women as autonomous people who could work and not do any of these gender practices if they wanted to. So I think it's an interesting question from a gender perspective, because we don't usually link cultural feminist theories to that time period. It's more cultural feminism, at least the way my understanding of it in the modern gender literature is really more about this modern period where some scholars have wanted to argue that it should be empowering and agentic enough to be able to do mothering in a high status way.
Yeah, I meant second wave. Oh, sorry, annoying noise, right?
Sounds like breast pump going.
Yes, I meant second wave feminism. So there is like also this rhetoric about womanhood and motherhood in this second wave, and it's also called white feminism. So I think there might be a link with this, and being in college in the 70s, I guess you have more exposure to these kind of ideas that were like very academic too, and they also have a racial component. So I was thinking that could have something to do with it.
I think that now I understand better. Thank you. I think that the second wave feminist links more to the scientific piece of actually being susceptible to those scientific arguments. I think plenty of second wave feminists, I think you could argue that should have been a downward pressure on the breastfeeding rates, that the white feminists would have preferred to not have breastfed as long. And that, that it's actually ironic that its rise coincides with this major kind of gender movement at the same time. But I think I think it's actually the scientific part of actually trying to do status, which isn't particularly feminist, but it is more class enabling that I think kicks in as an explanation.
So thank you, Vida. So we have 2 more questions posted on the chat. If you don't have background noise like Valentina, you can ask your questions directly, but I'm happy to read them.
Totally.
Anna is asking a question. What would be an approach to explaining the gray areas between the racial and educational inequalities in breastfeeding?
Anna, can you tell me more about what your question? Can you tell me more?
Yes. You might hear a toddler in the background, but
I love toddlers. Don't you worry.
You explained. So I'm not a quantitative person. I have a qualitative brain, so forgive my ignorance.
No.
But you explained this kind of what seemed to be a gray area, that the data wasn't able to explain the inequalities between the different groups. And I was just wondering, how would you statistically explain that, or would you need qualitative research?
Okay, now I understand. Thank you. There's a lot of there's most of the inequalities in breastfeeding are best explained qualitatively because it's such a multidimensional experience. It might actually not be a very good one to study holding all else constant. Like these partial derivatives, they're not meant for like total immersive experiences like this, right? But there's a lot of research, qualitative research, that tries to understand why Black women breastfeed less, and a lot of qualitative research that tries to understand why Hispanic and Latinx women breastfeed more. So I think both of these things have interesting inversions to them. And for the Black women, the major finding is that they are more accepting of formula than any other group is. So let me put that a different way. They find formula less stigmatizing than any other group finds formula. And so one question is kind of what is it that's transformed these other groups into seeing the stigmatizing part of using formula? And why is that different across groups? I think the answer to that is totally unknown. Another vein finds that the social networks of Black moms are less supportive of breastfeeding than the social networks of the other moms. Again, why is that the case? I don't know, but that's what the qualitative literature finds. And then a piece of the literature which is not race-based, but it's class-based, but the correlation of race and class in the US makes me think that it's at least interesting enough to tell you about it, is that men's responses to women breastfeeding really differ by class. And women describe differences in how they experience men's access to their body, men's demands to their body, and they describe a tension between being a partner and a sexually active person with the partner versus breastfeeding the child, and that the men are differentially pushy about this. Now, lower SES women, it's mostly done with lower SES women, and lower SES women literally describe their partners being unsupportive of breastfeeding for this reason. I am completely speaking away from the data now, but I think it wouldn't be then hard to argue that higher SES women might have power differentials such that it enables them to push that back a little, or that higher SES men are bought into this kind of intensive parenting ideal enough too, that everyone's trying to kind of enact this thing. So, there's almost no data on the men, and the men are a pretty important part of the story. And so I would say that the most promising place would actually be to try to get some information about how the couple negotiates that.
Can I don't want to interrupt the question flow, but if I could just have a comment, I'm happy to wait my turn if someone else would.
Who are new in the I'm going to stop recording in about 5 minutes. I'll give Vida 2 or 3 more questions to answer altogether, and then I'll stop recording. For anyone who wants to hang around and ask more questions to Vida, Vida is here until 6:30 of UK time. So we will have plenty of time to follow up those questions. Like Vida, if you're okay, I'll just read out 2 or 3 questions back to you, and then you answer them all at once, because I do think that some of them are related. I think Evelina asks a follow-up questions to Anna's question she just asked, and I think Mary Ellis asks a follow-up question to Evelina's question. So I'll read them first.
Okay.
Evelina says, regarding Anna's question, can it be linked to the need to go back to work, with potentially white women being able to afford to breastfeed for longer? And Mary Ellis says, related to Evelina's question, do you know if the historical trends you showed correspond with the women's labor force participation? Which she asked actually the question that I was carrying in my head. So thanks, Mary Ellis, for asking for that question for me too. And then I will go back to other questions that are asked by Sierra and Tanya. And Tanya is asking whether panel data could help. If you move from cross-sectional time series to panel data, what can be, she has put it in a much more elaborative, a nice way than I'm summarizing here. She says, what could be learned or gained from panel data as opposed to cross-sectional data following women as they attempt to navigate breastfeeding and the challenges that they face and keep the work going. And Sierra's question is about whether the turn in the 1970s, can we think that links to the integration in the United States in general? So these are the questions. If you can just give us about 5-6 minutes to wrap up all of them.
Yeah.
I'll stop recording.
Yep. Well, let me start with the panel data, because almost all of my work on breastfeeding uses panel data to study women across the life course and their work trajectories as they evolve after birth. This is work I do with Berkay, and we've been doing for a couple of years now. And so I think it's incredibly productive to think about both the short-term and the long-term consequences in terms of career trajectories that comes from this kind of time investment. And I would be super happy to talk to you about that for a really long time, but not today. I think what's challenging about panel data is it's just really hard to capture the time trends with panel data, right? It's really hard to look at this long view because there's very little panel data that actually captures breastfeeding information in a detailed way and links it to work. I mean, literally in the US, there's the NLSY 79, and when they're old enough, there's the NLSY 97, but they're only 35, so they're not old enough. And there's not very good work data in the ad health. So it's actually ironic how hard it is to study this pretty basic part of reproduction using panel data. Now, Berkay and I have set up all the panel data that I think you can bring to bear in the NLSY 79, and we can build pretty good work careers. And I guess I'll just leave you with this teaser and invite you to read the draft of the paper when it's out, when we have a good draft to share just very shortly here, that it has a very long-term effect on women's careers. 10, 15 years later, after breastfeeding is done, we can see the scarring effects on women's careers. Now that, I think, requires very careful statistical methods to try to address both the reverse causality and the selection, which we have tried very hard to do. But just to say, like, it's actually really hard to get trend data back far enough to answer these questions. But about work. So I think work is a very important place. I think work and marriage are actually very important variables. And these data do have some limited availability to work, but you quickly lose the years. You quickly shrink the time, kind of the trends. And so I do think that's promising. And I think that it makes sense to try to go back and try to use what we can about work and see what we can explain about the early gaps. When we tried to do that before, we basically ran out of data. So that's where that stands. I think that's a good idea because our current understanding of breastfeeding is that it completely competes with women's work. There's just one, I guess I just feel like I'm compelled to tell you one thing though, which is any breastfeeding, so breastfeeding at all, is something that can be done once or twice a day. And it's not the standard, but it's perfectly, so breastfeeding is, I don't actually know a tactful way of describing it, but it's kind of an on-demand service. And so the less demand there is, the lower the production, and the higher demand there is, the higher the production. And so it would be perfectly plausible that women could choose, and plenty of women choose to do this, where they choose to breastfeed just in the mornings and at night so that they can work during the day. You would need formula to make that happen. Your baby still needs food. But so one thing I'll say is all of these studies are really about any breastfeeding. And so in principle, work does not have to interfere with any breastfeeding. It unambiguously interferes with exclusive breastfeeding. But there are also qualitative studies that look at the invention of the breast pump as a way to enable higher SES women to continue to breastfeed, not just because of the cost, but the privacy that they have in their workspaces. Okay, so that's the work answer and the panel data answer. Berkay, was there another one I missed?
So about the US integration, and with that, I'll just stop recording, but we'll continue with the questions.
Yeah, I don't, you mean racial integration through the civil rights movement? Is that
yeah.
The implication?
That's right.
I don't know. I mean, I've never read anything about that, but that doesn't mean it's not relevant. I guess it really depends on what you think the mechanism is. If you think that the mechanism is community and social network support and seeing other people doing this thing, then one would think that that are very high levels of segregation probably reinforce race differences in breastfeeding. If you think about, I mean, there's also, so another angle that we've looked at, which I didn't talk about today, is actually media consumption. So Black and white Americans consume very different media. And so if the messaging is very different in the cultural information, then you might think that would be relevant. And for sure, that is true, that the media consumption is racialized. But the policies actually are not, and the policies have disproportionately targeted, there are actually specific policies that have targeted the Black women specifically in trying to get that through. So that's what I know, but I don't know the answer to that specifically.
So thank you, Vida. I'm stopping recording, but I'll continue with a lot of questions because we have a lot of them.
Okay.